In today's video, we're going to be having a look at Ant Group. We're also going to be looking at what the founder of Greenlight has said overnight. And from there, we're going to have a little bit of a quick chat about stimulus in the US. Hello and welcome to another ACY Securities Hot Topics video. My name is Alistair Schultz and I'm going to be your host through today's trading journey. The first thing that we're looking at today is what we've heard from Greenlight founder David Einhorn. He has called tech stocks the biggest bubble he's seen in quite some time. And of course, he is now also saying, and his big call is, that September 2nd was the top of this bubble and that it has already burst. Now, if you were looking at the S&P 500 or the NASDAQ, you can probably understand why it might look that way on a 1 hour chart. Now, he has also got short positions already on some of these, and his suggested evidence for why he thinks it's to be a bubble is we've got crazy IPO mania going on with people getting into a bit of a frenzy about new IPOs, particularly in stock sectors that are based on tech. We're also seeing lofty valuations for a lot of those companies, and of course, market concentration on groups and sectors, meaning that people are investing in very particular groups of stocks like the FANGs, and they are also investing very heavily in technology, which is why we see the NASDAQ just rising up so hard. In addition to all of that, massive trading volumes. Whenever you do get signals of a bubble of any kind, you get generally massive amounts of trade occurring. Whether that means trading in the physical sense like we're getting now with stocks and futures, or whether that be something like credit card debt, like we saw back sort of in the 80s where nearly everyone had a credit card. So there is some of the signals there that do define what you would expect to see in a bubble. And I'm not necessarily disagreeing with him, but I'm also not going to advocate for him either, because there are two sides of this. His Greenlight fund has lost about 16% this year. His track record for 2020 isn't exactly steaming ahead for us all right now. Now, looking at Ant Group, I have a little bit to discuss today on Ant Group, and this is because they have their IPO coming up. Now, so far, they're probably going to be reaching their $34.5 billion target. And the reason for that is because we are seeing the initial bids have already exceeded the amount of stocks being supplied by 280 times. So that's a monstrous amount of people trying to get their share into Ant Group. Now, some mum and dad investors are also running leverage at nearly 20 times, which is massive for an IPO. And it's obviously that is something that is systemic over in China that we're seeing this sort of happen, and in Hong Kong and Shanghai. But we're not seeing those same sort of results here, though I'm sure it would be possible to leverage up that far quite easily anywhere in the world. Now, looking at what's at a little bit more depth. Now, I'm a little bit pessimistic about Ant Group because, yes, it's going to be one of the largest IPOs. It's being listed on 2 different exchanges at once, and all of the other news that comes from it. They have already had a lot of success as Ant Group. They are rivaling in valuation compared to Morgan Stanley, if not above and beyond. So what could really go wrong? There's a couple of things here that I'm already looking at. We might see the valuation go on, but now I'm looking at the idea of what happens after the IPO. Now, one of the big ones is regulation, which has already sort of started. They've now already got interest rate restrictions and limits as to what they can really be offering on that sort of front for lenders. Of course, the international restrictions are probably more concerning about whether or not Ant Group is going to be allowed to operate in the US. And of course, many of the other Asian countries, India, have already banned them. So there's that side of things that we have to consider. We also have competition. Tencent, they weren't really on the market when Ant Group first came in. So at the time when Ant Group came in with Alipay and everything else, we were seeing that they had a market shareholdership of, they had a hold of the market of about 75%. Since Tencent's come into operation, got some very similar services, that's dropped to about 55%. So the chances of them ending up with more competition is likely growing, particularly the more success they have, the more interest other people are going to have in mimicking what they do. Now, of course, there's also governance. We know that financial entities in China do see a lot of regulation and control. So we might end up seeing that side of thing goes the wrong way, and that's probably more in part on the regulation side of things. But if we also look at Jack Ma's shareholdership of Ant Group, it does leave him quite open to be able to make any changes that he really wants to, because he is the dominant shareholder. Now, of course, if you had invested in any of Jack Ma's things before, you would have been laughing all the way to the bank. But that doesn't necessarily mean that sometimes it doesn't allow you to have much control. So even if you do have a vote, it doesn't really matter, is the point that I'm trying to make. Now, moving on for today, we're also talking about stimulus. Now, in my mind, the stimulus bill that we're seeing in the US, where we've been hearing about a fiscal policy or a fiscal bill of some kind, is practically impossible now. We are so close to the election. They've also had a bit of a break out of Congress and Senate before the election. They generally do that anyway. So that's leaving them less time to really negotiate. And at this stage, basically, Republicans and Democrats are playing the blame game and they're just blaming each other. So that's not real useful and certainly not doing any negotiation at all. So now it is likely to rest upon the actual election results, and we have to see what comes out of that afterwards. Now, I've kind of put 3 plausible scenarios. There are probably a few others here that I haven't got listed, but these are like the top 3 that I have in my mind. Now, of those, one of them is a Trump victory in the election, in which case we're likely to see a smaller package than Pelosi is looking for, meaning she's wanting between $1.8 and $2.2 trillion. I would anticipate it will be under the $1.8 trillion mark if Trump ends up being able to get through and get that red wave sort of thing happening. Now, if Joe Biden gets into place and we see a Senate flip, and that's important, we need to have the Senate flip. We need to see a blue wave, a Democratic House being run and the Senate being run. So if that occurs, then we will likely get the dollars that we want, but it will probably be later into 2021. Obviously, there is a certain amount of routines and changes that need to happen. We need to allow Republicans to have their last weeks in the Senate as well. So that will delay it a little bit. Now, the last one is potentially a split or a contested election, in which case 2021 stimulus is a maybe. You might see it by the middle of next year if we get lucky. So there are a few things to really consider on that front, and that is mostly to do with how long it will take if there is a contested election for there to be the change of hands, if there is need be of one, in roughly probably February. Last time we saw a contested election was George Bush and Al Gore, and that once the results came out in November, it wasn't until about February where we saw a decision through the court system. So that will impact all of this and when the stimulus falls in. So investors are now sort of turning away from looking at stimulus, and they've lost pretty much all hope of seeing one before the election. Now it's really got to keep our eyes on whether we get one in the fourth quarter at all. And that is going to be really dependent, and we are really going to be focusing on what happens on November 3rd. Now, one extra point I do want to make out when it comes to the election, since I'm kind of on that topic anyway, is if you actually look historically at the performance of stocks and around the election, you generally don't see them have too much movement on the whole over an entire year. So whilst the election is a big deal, it doesn't really make too much of an impact on the longer term running things. And that's important to remember so you don't get too hung up on what happens during the election week. Now, moving on from that, the news ahead of today, we have Credit Suisse economic expectations a little bit later in the session. Then we're straight into US durable good orders and their trade balance figures as well. So keep an eye on those. And from there, we also are going to be hearing from the Bank of Canada on monetary policy and their rate decisions later in the evening. So keep an eye on what's happening on there. Now, if you would like to get in contact with me about anything in this video, perhaps some of my other videos, or even the other sort of content that is produced by me, then please feel free to shoot me an email at talktoal@acy.com. And don't forget to like and subscribe to this video so you can get more great content from me and ACY Securities in the future. Have a great trading day ahead.